What is up, fight fans? This is DJC Combat, and in today's video, I want to talk about top 5 title fights in the UFC that never should have happened, were never really in the UFC's original plans, and ended in disasters. And when I say disasters, I mean disasters not for the champion, but for the challenger. And I'm going to start at number 5. First on the list, TJ Dillashaw versus Joe Soto. This was TJ Dillashaw's first title defense as a champion. He was originally supposed to immediately rematch Renan Barão. But then literally on weigh-ins day, Renan Barão passed out during the weight cut process. And then the fight was canceled like the night before. Joe Soto was already, set to make his UFC debut on the same card. But I think he may have been like the only bantamweight who was on that UFC 177 card. So he got the opportunity to fight for the belt to replace Renan Barão against TJ Dillashaw. However, it was his UFC debut. So clearly, Joe Soto wasn't ready. He was unranked, and he shouldn't have been in there with TJ Dillashaw. Now, he did manage to survive almost 5 rounds. Like, he made it to the 5th round, but not to the final bell. Eventually, he was stopped by a head kick in similar fashion to how Dillashaw won the belt against Barão, wobbled his opponent with a head kick. Then the opponent goes stumbling down. Then Dillashaw gets a finish with ground and pound. Same outcome, different opponent. But yeah, it shouldn't have been Joe Soto in there. It should have been Renan Barão. Even though Barão wasn't going to win that fight anyway, at least Renan Barão was a former, not dominant champ, but he had a long win streak before TJ beat him. He was the number 1 contender as a former champion. So it should have been him. Unfortunately, he couldn't make the weight. Not only could he not make the weight, he literally fell ill. So it is what it is. But that completely, not only did Soto get destroyed that night, but this literally, I believe, had an impact on Soto's future as a whole in the UFC, because Soto started his UFC career 0-3, lost to Dillashaw, lost his first ever UFC championship fight, his only ever UFC championship fight, which I believe took a big hit on his confidence. He went on to lose to Anthony Burchak, who I think he was supposed to fight in his debut. Lost again to, I don't know how to pronounce the guy's name, but he lost again, won 3 straight after, and then ended his UFC career on a 2-fight loss streak. Whereas if that fight with Dillashaw didn't happen, who knows how much different his UFC career could have turned out if circumstances were different. And then number 4, Khabib Nurmagomedov versus Raging Al Iaquinta. Another title fight that was literally short notice. It was literally 1 day notice. Khabib Nurmagomedov literally had 3 different opponents for UFC 223. He was originally slated to fight Tony El Cucuy Ferguson, but of course Tony Ferguson versus Khabib is a cursed fight, not meant to be. So of course Tony Ferguson, of all ways he could have pulled out of this fight, literally tripped over a cable and tweaked his knee. So Holloway steps in, but then the day before, the commission said that Holloway wasn't fit to make the weight. So Holloway's out of the fight, and Al Iaquinta was on the card. He may have been the highest ranked lightweight on the card. I'm not sure, but I think that's why they picked him and not Chiesa and not Felder. I know why they didn't pick Anthony Pettis. That's because he was coming off a loss, to be fair. So they went with Al Iaquinta, who was ranked number 11. And of course, Al Iaquinta gets beat up for 5 rounds. However, Al did come out of that fight with a moral victory because he did survive 5 rounds. He did what Gaethje, Dustin, and Conor failed to do, which is survive against Khabib. Khabib finished the rest of those other guys I mentioned. Al was able to defend a good majority of Khabib's takedowns. make it to a decision, showed his toughness, showed his heart. But in the end, Khabib Nurmagomedov was just too much, and he never should have been in there with Khabib. It should have been Tony, or it should have been Max, or literally anyone else who was like in the top 5 of the welterweight division, the lightweight division. Anyone but Al Iaquinta. But him getting that moral victory, so to speak, against Khabib did earn him a big opportunity. It earned him a main event on Fox and a top 5 opponent in Kevin Lee, in which he did go on to beat Kevin Lee to crack the top 5 of the lightweight division, although the rest of his career didn't go well moving forward. At least this fight did give him a big opportunity. But yeah, shouldn't have been Khabib versus Al Iaquinta. Number 3, Tyron Woodley versus Darren Till. Now, this one is really sad because Darren Till was an undefeated, confident, rising prospect. He stopped Donald Cerrone to crack the top 10 to even make the welterweight rankings. He beat Cerrone, which then got him a title eliminator essentially against Stephen Wonderboy Thompson, which honestly, the UFC probably shouldn't have booked him against the number 1 contender. They probably should have given him someone lower in the top 10. But they gave him Wonderboy, which it worked out in his favor. He beat Wonderboy, but then right after he gets a shot at Tyron Woodley, but it wasn't supposed to be Darren Till. It was supposed to be Colby Chaos Covington, who was the interim champion, who won the interim title off defeating RDA. However, Colby Covington was not ready for the date that was booked for Woodley's comeback, because Woodley was coming off a year layoff from a shoulder injury, and the UFC wanted Woodley versus Covington in September 2018, but Covington was getting a nasal surgery, so that's why he couldn't take the fight. But they chose Darren Till instead of any other ranked opponent. Till was ranked number 2, to be fair, but Till evidently was not ready to be in there with Tyron Woodley, let alone fighting for the belt. And he got absolutely destroyed by Tyron Woodley. In that fight, he was completely hesitant, didn't even land a single strike, barely threw a single strike, then gets dropped in round 2 the moment he commits, gets smashed on the ground, subbed in round 2, and then after that, gets knocked out by Masvidal, and then only bounces back with 1 win in a new division against Kelvin, and then goes on to lose 3 more fights, and now he's not in the UFC anymore. And who knows where Darren Till would be today if Colby Covington was ready for that opportunity against Woodley, or if the UFC had just picked maybe Kamaru Usman for the September 2018 date and made Till fight someone else. Till's future may have been different. He may have not had the downfall that he went on to have had that Woodley fight not happened, which is extremely unfortunate. And then number 2, Kamaru Usman versus Jorge Masvidal. The UFC was, I think, always planning to give Jorge Masvidal the rematch with Usman, whether he earned it or not, because Jorge Masvidal had that superstar privilege because he became a star off winning the BMF title fight against Nate Diaz, and also having that viral 5-second KO in the first round against Ben Askren, and also knocking out Till. Him having a big 2019 made him a superstar. That changed his career and kind of turned him into a privileged fighter. He did earn and deserve the first shot at Usman, but the second shot, it shouldn't have been him. He literally hadn't fought a year prior to that rematch. Usman had already fought he fought once since that first fight against Gilbert Burns, but I think at UFC 261, it should have been the number 1 ranked welterweight contender in the world, Colby Chaos Covington. Colby did go on to get a shot against Usman one card after, 5 months later. But he should have got that shot in April instead of November. And Jorge Masvidal should have had to work his way back by either fighting Gilbert Burns or Leon Edwards, but instead he holds his top 3 spot in the rankings, doesn't fight anybody, and he gets an undeserved rematch against Usman, and he gets beat worse than the first fight, because of course, I mean, he gets the rematch because the first fight he took it on short notice, so he wanted a full camp. There was a storyline based off that, but it still didn't need to happen. But he got his wish, he got a full camp, but again, beaten worse than the first fight, and gets brutally knocked out in the second round, and was never the same since, and had never won a fight again in his UFC career. And even outside the UFC, this man is still taking L's because he just lost to Nate Diaz in boxing. I can't say he wins any other fight. If he didn't take the Usman rematch, he probably would still lose to other top contenders because Masvidal was never that good to begin with. But I do believe taking this Usman rematch and suffering that career-changing knockout, I think that definitely did hurt his career. I think that was kind of the nail in the coffin for Jorge Gamebred Masvidal. Now, last but not least, number one on the list, Alexander Volkanovski versus the Korean Zombie. It shouldn't have been TKZ. It should have been Max. Originally, the UFC was working on Holloway Volkanovski 3 for the first quarter of 2022. But then weirdly enough, Max Holloway gets injured, like right when they're about to deem that rematch trilogy official. Then Korean Zombie gets the call to step in, not on short notice because he had like a 3-month head start to take the fight, but he gets given the opportunity to replace Max Holloway when he was literally coming off one win against Dan Ige, where he didn't even look that good. And before that, he lost to Brian Ortega in dominant fashion, who went on to be dominated by Volkanovski. And TKZ, by that point in his career, no longer in his prime, old, war-torn. Volkanovski was literally in the prime of his career. And I believe 2022 was the best Alexander Volkanovski has ever been in terms of being in his prime. He peaked. He was in his best form that year, whereas TKZ was at his worst form, and the fight ended in a disaster. The Korean Zombie got absolutely schooled, outclassed, had nothing for Volk. It wasn't even a fight. And tragically, like I said, brutalized and gets stopped inside 4 rounds. And of course, Volk went on to destroy Max Holloway in the trilogy. But TKZ didn't need to be punished for Max Holloway pulling out. They could have easily just rescheduled that fight for like a few months later instead of trying to find a replacement. And Sterling versus Jan could have easily headlined UFC 273 on its own. They did not need Volkanovski versus TKZ to carry the card. And I mean, the Korean Zombie's downfall was coming regardless because he got outclassed by Ortega. But again, he should not have been in there to fight for the belt against Volk. That fight should have never been sanctioned. That fight was absolute murder. It was sad. Now, that concludes my top 5. However, I'm going to add some honorable mentions. So, for the first honorable mention, I'm going to say Nunes versus Rousey. Now, Ronda Rousey, arguably did deserve a title shot because she was a dominant champion. She should have gotten an immediate rematch against Holm, but decided to take time off. So, okay, arguably, yeah, maybe she should have been in there with Nunes, but at the same time, she was coming off a bad knockout against Holly. Time off was needed, but she definitely needed a tune-up fight. Fighting Amanda Nunes coming off a knockout loss was the last thing she needed. Didn't even last a minute and got her career ended. And then, speaking of Volk, who is number 1 on this list, Islam Makhachev versus Alexander Volkanovski 2. Alexander Volkanovski gets punished for Oliveira pulling out of the second fight. Alexander Volkanovski was coming off the couch, coming off an arm injury. He wasn't in shape, was barely training, and then gets the call. He makes a mistake by accepting the fight against Islam and gets knocked out in the first round by a head kick, and his career from there has been essentially ruined because look at him now. He comes back too soon against Ilya, gets knocked out, 2 straight knockout losses in a row, and I think this may be the end of Alexander Volkanovski. And if he never took that fight with Makhachev, maybe he beats Ilya Topuria. Maybe he doesn't go on this downfall if not for taking that Islam fight. But that's it for this video. Let me know what you guys think in the comment section down below. Like and subscribe, and peace.